So welcome everybody and good morning. Welcome to the BIH lecture, which today is given by Frank Dobbin. And it's a very special lecture on a very important topic, which faculty diversity programs do work. That is the question here. And we have a speaker who has a unique experience in that field. So let me briefly introduce Frank Dobbin, who's with us here in Berlin already for some time, because he currently a research fellow at the German Institute for Integration and Migration Research. And he will be in Berlin until the end of next week. So if anybody is inspired, it will be inspired. There's room for contacts, personal contacts that can be created. So Frank is a Henry Ford II professor at social sciences at Harvard, obtained a PhD from Stanford and holds prestigious and precious fellowships from Guggenheim Foundation, Russell Sage Foundation, the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences, the Radcliffe Institute, the Safra Center for Ethics, and also here in Europe from the Netherlands Institutes for Advanced Study. There you already see that his research topic is of great importance in the United States and also here in Europe. Now, unfortunately, recent developments in the United States at the government level have led to an active suppression of research and measures in the field of diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI. And we are also here in Europe at risk that the atmosphere and policies can change. So we have to do something to stand up and actively discuss even more than before what needs to be done. And we need empirical research and we need data also in that field. And that is what Frank is delivering here as a renowned scholar and author who investigates the effectiveness of diversity programs in the private sector and in the public sector. So in close to 1,000 companies, I think, and now more recently, together with Alexandra Kalev, also he took this question to the university level and the level of colleges and other research institutes in the United States, and we do very, very well to adopt many of this empirical approach also here in Europe. Now, the BIH for sure is committed to promoting all dimensions of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we are also alarmed that if you suppress this or no longer do anything for diversity, equity, and inclusion, that the opposite will happen, which is conformity, the dimensions of sexism and racism, the disparity and exclusion. And we feel that to advance science also quality-wise, we really have to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so we are really interested in the results of the research that you will present as an institute that is dedicated to quality in science, for which BIH really stands in many dimensions in the field of medicine. So here at this point, I will give the word to Karin, who is our officer for equality measures at BIH. She's heavily involved also in the Berlin community for DEI policy making and measures. And so maybe Karin, you can explain a bit more about what we are doing.
Thank you very much, and also welcome from my side. Let me just give you a brief overview about what we are doing as an institution in terms of EDI. So when we look at the numbers of our institution, we can see that 1/4 of our employees are international colleagues, most of them working as scientists. But we also know that the diversity of leadership is less or smaller than among early career researchers. Women, according to our statistics, are the majority of the workforce, but when it comes to professorship positions, we only have a share of around 38% of women professors, which is still more than in many other institutions. To learn more about the diversity of the people who are working at the Berlin Institute of Health and about their experience of discrimination, we recently conducted a survey among our employees and will get the results soon so that we can discuss this in detail. Our support as an institution ranges from individual support for colleagues who take care of children and elderly, It's individual coaching and mentoring for women scientists and scientists from historically marginalized groups, but also education and awareness, such as an annual diversity month, as an opportunity to network and to educate ourselves about certain topics. And also we implemented structural measures to ensure sustainable change, such as, for example, the equal participation of male and female PIs in the self-governance of the Institute. So we are really excited to learn more about your findings from the US and would like to discuss this in detail with you. But to start with, also a few technical information also for those who are joining us online. The online participants can ask their questions later in the chat. I'm going to collect them and ask them to Frank, so they will not be lost and you will get answers to your questions. Those in the audience here, you can get the microphone later and ask your questions personally in this room. The whole lecture will be recorded and edited afterwards, but we only record the pictures here in the front, so you won't be recorded here in the audience. And those online, if you have any difficulties, technical difficulties, please post them in the chat and we will try to solve them. And those who need live captions can also individually switch them on in the Zoom account. And with this, I would like to hand over to Frank. Welcome to the BIH.
Everybody can hear. Thank you very much. Okay, those of you online, how's that working? Okay, great. Well, I'll start over again. Thank you very much to both Christopher and Karin for the nice introductions. I'm grateful to Karin for inviting me to be here. I'm excited to be here because I do feel you're in a space where you haven't adopted all of the disastrous American diversity programs that most universities have adopted. So it's not too late for you to adopt the things that actually work. And it's one reason I've been enjoying over the years speaking in Europe, because corporations also are kind of behind on diversity programs, so they haven't copied the whole retinue of problematic programs. I'm an organizational sociologist, so that means I study the history of management, contemporary management practices, and increasingly the efficacy of those practices. In this case, I'll talk about the efficacy of diversity programs. A lot of organizational sociologists have moved into studying, rather than the diffusion of organizational management strategies, their actual effects on organizations. So I published with Alexandra Kalev, who is the second author, but my full co-collaborator on this project, second listed here. I published in 2022 a book on our findings about corporate diversity programs, which things are effective, which things don't do anything, and which things are counterproductive. So from that, we had a pretty good sense of what to look at, because we'd been doing that research for 20 years. We had a pretty good sense 10 years ago of what we should look at in university diversity programs to try to figure out which things are effective and which things are not. So today I'll be talking about the effects of diversity programs designed to diversify the faculty to increase, in particular, race, ethnic, by gender diversity in the faculty. And I will be talking about their effects on the tenured faculty. So it means associate and full professors who can't be fired. As you know, we have a very different career system in universities than you do. I might put it this way, we have a career system in universities. So it's quite imperfect, but so what got us interested in this was not just, so what got us interested in moving from corporations to faculties was not just that we wanted to look at our own world and do what people call me sociology. It's that it really matters what the faculty looks like. It matters to students. So one of the problems American universities have is that they have low retention and completion rates. So where I live, Massachusetts, the closest big public university to where I live is University of Massachusetts at Dartmouth. University of Massachusetts at Dartmouth has about a 50%, 50 to 60%, depending on the year, 6-year completion rate. That means half or 40% of people don't finish their degrees, of the people who've started their degrees. And it's fairly expensive. You have to move there to live there. It's geographically isolated. So the problem with this statistic is it's disproportionately disadvantaged white students who are first generation college students and Black, Hispanic men and women who don't finish. So what we see in this graph is across the 600, so I'm going to show you data for 640 colleges and universities, mostly large colleges and universities, over time, over the same period of time, 1993 to 2016. I see this one's cut off 1 year early, but so here we're looking at changes in the undergraduate population among these 640 schools. So we see that Hispanic men and women are making up a larger and larger share of the undergraduate population in these schools. And that Black men and women have kind of held their own, moved up gradually over this period. But we know that people from those groups in particular are significantly less likely to finish college if there isn't someone who looks like them on the faculty. And it's true for white women in the sciences. If there isn't another woman in the physics department, you're just less likely to stay in the department and less likely to finish your BA. So here's the problem. If these are the same groups, so the representation of Black and Hispanic men and women is just increasing very slowly. And it's very far away from representing the undergraduate population. This is one of the main reasons we're seeing high dropout rates. I'm just showing you here, white women are increasing, but not extremely quickly. So what we've done to try to figure out what sorts of diversity programs and really career programs generally universities ought to be putting into place is we collected data from our own survey where we surveyed about 640 public and private universities stratified random sample, but basically we tried to get all the universities that are big, and then a representative sample of smaller ones, because there are about 5,000 colleges and universities in the US, but some of them are tiny. So in that survey, we asked them about all kinds of diversity and career programs, how you hire people, how you promote people. And we asked them when they had each of these programs. So for example, we know that they had like legalistic diversity training in 2015 for the first time, or in 2006 for the first time. And so year by year, we can trace when every university put in every policy. None of these policies are required by law. So they kind of did whatever they wanted. It's discrimination is illegal in the United States, employment discrimination, but what that means isn't specified in the law. So universities chose their own set of practices and they put them in often one by one. So we have a lot of analytic leverage to figure out what actually happens to the faculty as a consequence of putting in these programs. To my knowledge, nobody else has tried anything like this. It cost us a great deal of money to collect our own survey data, and it was very time consuming to both collect the data and put them together so the other data source is a federal survey of all colleges and universities, which they are required to fill out every year. And what we're looking at is we're looking at the diversity of the students, representation of each of the same 8 groups I'll be talking about, of the junior faculty, and then as an outcome variable of the tenured faculty, the senior faculty. And so we use panel models with fixed effects for school and year, robust standard errors, and we're modeling how changes in the practices and other programs affect actual diversity of the tenured faculty. So there are basically 4 takeaways. Before I get to that, let me just say a little bit about the tenure system in the US in case you're not aware of how it works. Most people who get tenure are promoted from within their universities. So they're hired as assistant professors, either right after they finish their PhD or after they've done a postdoc or 2. So whatever, 2 years to 6 years after they finish their PhD. They're hired as assistant professors, and after 6 or 8 years, typically, depending on the university, they come up for tenure. And they can be, either they're promoted and they enter a tenured line which they can remain in for the rest of their lives, or they're fired. It's basically, your options are dichotomous. So in a place like, at a place like Harvard, historically, the tenure rate was very low, like 1 in 10. It's gotten better, but a place like University of California at Berkeley, historically, it's about 3/4 who get tenure. At some lower ranked schools, it's 90%, 95%. The trick there is that some people leave before they get tenure because they think they're not going to get tenure, or because they face a hostile environment, or because their students don't treat them with respect, or their colleagues don't treat them with respect. So what we're essentially modeling is who gets tenure, and we're controlling for who's already on the faculty. That is the percent of Asian women professors, junior professors on the faculty. So we're controlling for that, and we're trying to figure out to isolate the effects of particular programs in allowing people to be promoted. A few people are hired with tenure from outside, but that's relatively rare. And even if you take those people out, it doesn't have much of an effect on what we would be finding. So all of the slides basically take the same form. Well, let me first start talk about this a little bit. The go-to solution in American corporations for diversity issues has been, since at least the 1980s, and this goes back to the 1960s, but the go-to solution has been two things: diversity and sexual harassment training. So these start, well, let me just take diversity training. This starts now with instruction in the science of stereotyping. And right now, in the last 10 years, it's been instruction in implicit bias. And the goal of this is to prove to you, to every single person in this room, that they are biased. And to prove that, you usually have to take this implicit association test, which shows your level of bias against individual groups. There's a test for each group. So whites versus blacks, Asian Americans versus whites, people with disabilities versus people without disabilities, older people versus younger people. So the first thing they try to do is convince everyone in the room that they're biased. People do not like to hear that they're biased, and they don't think they are. If you ask the most ardent neo-Nazi in the United States whether they're biased, they will say, well, this group, they don't belong in this country, but that's because they don't deserve to be here. That's not bias, that's just realism. So people don't like to think they're biased. You can't convince people they're biased. And then they usually follow that up with legalistic language about what will happen to you. So now we're talking about diversity training of the faculty. What will happen to you as a senior faculty member if you show signs of bias? Which means, and then there's some examples which are like, you can't ask a job candidate if she has children or if she's married. Things that they had been asking their whole lives. That would signal that you're biased. You can't ask somebody with an accent what country they're from, because that would signal that you're biased. So these are things that there's good reason to prevent people from using those kinds of answers to those kinds of questions in making a hiring decision, but it does freak out the people who are in these programs, partly because white men have been asking every woman who they've ever interviewed, do you have any kids? Or they've asked every person who has an accent, oh, what country do you come from? The other thing that is almost ubiquitous, so that's almost ubiquitous, diversity training. Years ago, I managed to prevent the diversity committee from putting diversity training in at Harvard, and they still don't have it, but they have sexual harassment training. So the other thing that is ubiquitous, over 90% of universities have complaint systems where you can use what you were just trained about to file a complaint against a grievance for discrimination or for harassment against your boss, typically, against someone higher than you in the department who you think is discriminated against you, or who has harassed you, really anyone who's harassed you. We know from a lot of research on complaint systems that they backfire. People who file complaints in the federal bureaucracy, there's some huge federal studies of this. If you file a complaint, you're more likely to be out of your job in a year than people who experience the same kinds of harassment or discrimination and didn't file a complaint. And it's for obvious reasons. If you file a complaint, well, for one thing, your boss tries to get rid of you because the complaint is probably against your boss. And for another thing, all the friends of your boss won't hire you into their departments. And often, if it's a harassment complaint, you just get harassed more frequently. The problem with these programs, I'll show the effects in a minute. The problem with these programs is that they define the faculty as the problem to be solved, and they freak faculty out. They don't want to be told that they're biased, and they don't want to have the threat that something they say or do that they consider to be innocuous can be the basis for firing, which technically can happen, but it never happens. So, okay, the rest of the slides will look the same. So if I'm losing you And also, if you have questions, if you're online, please ask them now, because I hate to get to the end and realize no one understood any of the slides. So I'm going to show you the effects of a bunch of different practices. And again, this is on the after adoption share of each group in the tenured faculty. So on the left, you have diversity training for faculty. The first bar well, for each of these graphs, where there's a bar, it means there was a statistically significant effect. And where there's no bar, just a placeholder, it means I'm not showing you the coefficient because it wasn't statistically significant at 0.05. Yes, question. So all different kinds. A lot of it is online for an hour now. When we separate the different kinds, it doesn't make that much difference. So the patterns seem to hold. So this is just for faculty. Okay. Is this also training for the students or just the bosses? This is training for faculty, all faculty. Separately, I'm not looking at student training. And this is for training for faculty about diversity among the faculty. So it's not training for faculty in how to deal with students. It's training for faculty in how to deal with the career system that they're given. So what we see here is in the left graph, we see that diversity training for faculty, whatever the form, on average, it's followed by a 5% decrease in Black men in net of all else on the tenured faculty, 3%, sorry, and about a 6% decrease in Hispanic women and about a 3 or 4% decrease in Asian American men. These are not huge decreases, but they're not supposed to be negative. They're supposed to be positive. Diversity trainers hate a slide like this because they think that their work is having positive effects. Harassment training, we're seeing only negative effects for Black women and Asian American women. Good question. So right now we're looking, in what time frame do you find the reductions? So we're looking at 1993 to 2016 here, and these practices are adopted at different points in time by different universities. So we look at the average effect in each university in the years after it was adopted. So when we see like a negative, here we see for civil rights grievance procedure, that's a discrimination complaint procedure. Is there a way we can prevent that? Okay. So we're seeing a negative effect of about 7% for Black men. So what that means is if on average this was in place for 20 years, the negative effect would be of 7% would usually be at about 10 years. Most of the graphs, most of the lines keep going up for the things that work and down for the things that backfire.
So there's one question online, which is how is casualty of these effects identified?
So here we have two-way fixed effects models where we're trying to essentially look at organizations before and after this intervention was put in. We're controlling for all other practices, all of other hiring, promotion, diversity practices in the same model. We're controlling for the composition of the students in the university and the composition of the junior faculty. So the people who are at risk of being promoted into senior faculty jobs. So obviously, if there are no Hispanic women in the whole university in junior jobs, it's going to be hard for them to be promoted. We also use difference in difference models, which are a little more rigorous. I'm not going to, those are a little bit complicated to show because the N changes. So we haven't completed anyway doing the difference in differences model. But that in general, our findings are robust to those. So what we're seeing with the civil rights grievance procedure, this is a grievance procedure for complaining about discrimination, is that it only has negative effects on one group, Black men. And harassment grievance procedures, we see 3 negative effects on Hispanic, Asian, Hispanic women, Asian men, and Asian women. So in general, these things aren't working. And they also don't work in corporations. This is similar to the kind of pattern we see in corporations. But the rest of the, so that was one point. I know I belabored that, but hopefully you have a sense of what how the models are working now. So those interventions both signal that the problem that universities face is that their faculties are biased, and we have to get them to change either by training them to convince them that they're biased and or by threatening to punish them if they act on those biases. And that just isn't working. And it doesn't work in companies. It's just not the most effective way to make change. Unfortunately, it's very popular, partly because university deans hired the same consultants who built the same programs in companies. So they hired, university deans hired McKinsey. Now, the stuff I talked about so far, any psychologist or sociologist studying diversity or equal opportunity knew that 30 years ago, before their universities adopted these policies, and they didn't ask us. If they'd asked us, and most of this work was done by psychologists, they didn't ask the psychologists, they wouldn't have put these practices in. But unfortunately, they copied what McKinsey was selling to their corporate clients. But from now on, I'm talking about things that work. And what's disappointing about the things that work is that they're not nearly as popular among universities as the things that don't work, which I think partly explains why we have very high attrition from the professoriate of all groups except white men. White men have the lowest attrition. Asian American men are similar. So what can you do to recruit and promote more diverse faculty? So instead of making faculty the problem, ask them to build a solution themselves. So instead of trying to stigmatize them with diversity training, ask them to look at the data and try to come up with something. So the single most effective thing seems to be putting together a task force. So what a task force does, typically the dean or the president asks all the department chairs to come together on a task force, or send your lieutenant if you can't come yourself. And we're going to have that task force, often the president's on it. We're going to have it meet 4 times a year. HR is going to give us the hiring, promotion, loss data by race, gender, ethnicity, and whatever else we have collected data on. In most universities, that's about it. But parental status and age, that they can usually provide as well. Let's look at the data. Let's try to figure out where our problems are, come up with solutions. So we're not hiring enough people from certain groups. Let's look at the data and figure out how to solve that. Or we're not promoting enough people from certain groups. Let's look at the data. Or people from certain groups are leaving early, disproportionately. Let's look at that and try to figure out what's going on. So here I just split out 4 different kinds of task forces. They're all showing positive effects. None of them are showing any negative effects. These are amazingly popular with the people who join the task forces, because often people will say, I didn't care about diversity because this is a meritocratic organization. I know it is. I spent my whole life here. I was an undergraduate at Harvard, a graduate student, an assistant professor, a full professor. I know it's fair. And then they get on this task force and they start hearing the stories of people for whom Harvard was not fair, or whatever their university is. They start hearing that actually it's not fair, and they start looking at the statistics and they're like, why did so many people who got PhDs in the social sciences just leave in the first 5 years after they'd done all this work and go to a job outside of academia? Why? Why are most of them women? So the chairs get together, they look at the data, they come up with solutions, they go back home to their departments. We need a mentoring program. None of the women seem to have mentors. So they put that program into place, then they come back in 3 months and they look again, and you do that for a couple of years. I was on the standing gender task force at Harvard for about 10 years. We'd come back and realize, oh, that thing we did 3 years, it didn't work. We got to figure out something else. We have to keep trying until we find what works. So you can see why that could be effective. It makes faculty part of the solution. And it also, there's no shaming in the beginning. You must be biased. That's why you're here. We're going to re-educate you. It's just, can you help us solve this problem? And even if you don't think there's a problem, as soon as you start looking at the data, you realize there is. Here's another way to get leaders and faculty involved. So one thing is just to put in a diversity staff person. So we're seeing only positive effects for some of these groups from putting in a diversity staff person. And another thing to do is get the deans involved by getting them to collect data on things that might affect career progression. So here we have review of the applicant pool. Every time there's a junior search advertised, the deans look at the applicant pool and they look at who the department wants to invite. And sometimes they say, you want to invite 3 people, but the 4th person on your list is the only woman. Let's invite that person too. So departments know somebody's looking at them. And that has an amazing effect on getting people to think more slowly about their decisions and to try to be fairer in their decision-making. And the second thing is review of startup funds. There's a lot of evidence that women and people of color don't get the same kind of $1 million startup funds to build a chemistry lab that white men do for a variety of reasons. And arguably, whatever the reasons behind this, people should, coming into the same job as a new assistant professor, they should get the same resources. It increases their likelihood of succeeding if they get maximal resources. So here we're seeing positive effects for 2 groups. And then time and rank is just how long you're stuck as an associate professor, which women are disproportionately stuck for longer than men. There are also parts of the career system that we could try to eliminate bias from. So one is about recruiting. So anywhere you can identify bottlenecks or problems in the career system, and you could address them to try to make them more equitable, you're likely to get some positive effects. So recruitment. So many schools will only recruit junior professors from the top 10 departments in their field. Well, one thing about those top 10 departments is none of them are at historically Black colleges, and none of them are at Hispanic serving institutions. None of them are at historically women's institutions. None of them are at engineering schools or medical schools that disproportionately enroll women of color, for example. So if you want people from those groups, you have to go to the graduate institutions that they're likely going to be studying at. And one way to do that is, and this is the thing that most universities do. They put in targeted recruitment or target of opportunity programs. And that means if you're in a biology faculty and you have a very narrow search for somebody in a very specific field, but you find a person from a underrepresented group, Hispanic men, who you have no faculty from, the dean will say, yeah, you can hire that person too. You can hire the person in the field you want, and you can hire that person too. That's what target of opportunity programs are. And we could get into why it's a good idea just mathematically to do that if you want to diversify the faculty. But here we're seeing solid positive effects, and just often in some cases, there will be a compensating effect for negative effect for white men. That's just because these are all proportions. So especially if the coefficients for everything is positive, we're not necessarily seeing significance, but if all the coefficients are positive for historically underrepresented groups, then it's often white men will see a significant decline. But this is all very good news, and often it happens kind of behind the scenes. So another place where there's systemic bias in career systems is in mentoring. We all know that from undergraduate years, from graduate years, your mentor is super important to your success in academia. The problem with mentoring program, with informal mentoring, which many universities have, they'll even have supports for informal mentoring, is that they don't make sure that everybody gets a mentor. So there are two ways schools do this. We have the thing on the left, Harvard has a thing on the left, which was put in to address diversity, to address inequality in mentoring, allocation of mentoring resources. We established departmental mentoring programs about 10 or 15 years ago, where each department has to have their own mentoring program. And the main thing they do is they make sure that every assistant professor has a mentor, nobody's left out. So just making sure that nobody's left out of mentoring shows big positive, significant positive effects for 4 of the 7 historically disadvantaged groups. And the other coefficients are positive, but not significant. So I'm not showing them. Another way to do this is to have a university level program that's designed to make sure that women and people of color get mentors. And we're seeing quite positive effects from that kind of a program as well. Both of these things seem to work. So this just goes again to what parts of the career system are biased and how could we address that? So the final thing I want to talk briefly about is work-life supports. So most work-life supports in universities were championed by white women senior faculty members. And so a lot of people associate these supports with white women's interest. One thing we found in our research on corporations is that work-life supports tend to be extremely helpful for women and men of color. And that's partly because women and men of color are more likely than white women and men to be in dual career couples where both people have highly demanding jobs. And they're less likely than white couples to have the wealth to accommodate shocks like having a baby or having twins. So white couples, when we interview, they'll say, oh yeah, we hired a night nurse for 4 months. I don't know if you've ever looked into hiring, we had twins. We looked into hiring a night nurse and we figured that's going to cost about $30,000 for 4 months. So we'll make it work. But white couples are just more likely to have the resources. White couples in the US have, on average, 10 times the wealth of Black couples, 10 times the wealth of Hispanic couples. They just don't have the flexibility. So any kind of work-life supports that gives people more flexibility or provides some kind of resources apparently can help all groups of women and groups of minority men to stay on the faculty. The models for groups of minority men get more complicated because a lot of these programs are only available to women, so we have to look at whether they're available to men. So I'm just going to show you the effects of women. Just having a work-life office, which is just a place you can go and say, hey, I have a problem. Can you help me figure it out? What do you recommend? I'm gonna have a child in the middle of a semester and I need some time off, but I kind of need the time off after the child, but I'll need to be out of the classroom for 4 weeks in the semester. What can we do? That is showing very solid positive effects, some of the biggest effects for Black, Hispanic, and Asian American women. Partner job search aid. You get offered an assistant professorship, but your partner needs a job and your partner's in some other field. That's having solid positive effects for Black and Asian women. Part-time tenure track is a way for you to take 12 years on the tenure clock, working half-time so you can have more time for your family. Parental supports, a semester off of teaching or a year off for new parents. Solid positive effects for 3 of the 4 groups. Tenure extensions for new mothers, solid positive effects for Hispanic and Asian American women. And then these are just different kinds of child care and elder care. I want to just point you to the 4th one, elder care referral. So this is not a benefit in terms of financial benefit. It's just the Work-Life Office has a webpage where you can find elder care resources in the community. You can look that up yourself, but the fact that the Work-Life Office has this on their website suggests that the university wants to help you. They want to help you stay here rather than quit so you can take care of your dying parent for 6 months, or your dad who has Alzheimer's and you can't get him to go into assisted living. You can't get him to go into a residential program, and you got to convince him.
Frank, just a brief question. Is there an explanation why some of the measurements work so differently for different ethnic groups?
I would caution that I'm not showing the coefficients for the groups that didn't quite reach 0.05 statistical significance. So in some cases, the other groups are very close to achieving statistical significance, but showing the confidence intervals and the coefficient sizes gets extremely complicated, or it just gets hard to read this many slides. So in general, where you see positive effects for 1 or 2 groups, we're finding positive effects for the others, but they're not quite statistically significant. And this is like a first cut on the data. This is the first run of analyses we've done. I think the models will clear up a little bit when we do more research into outliers and such. But if you see interesting patterns, I mean, it's not like there are no significant patterns, but in a given slide, I wouldn't know what's going on. Okay, well, I appreciate your asking questions as we went along. I went 7 minutes longer than I had intended to, but got some questions in the way. Thank you so much for being here. This just summarizes what you should do and what you shouldn't do. You should not try to quash personal bias with grievance processes and diversity training, but these other things you can do, oh, I switched the order of put leaders in charge, task forces, try to de-bias career systems when you can see biases in mentoring, in how you recruit people, and try to normalize work-life support so that people get the message that the university wants them to stay, even through challenges associated with having an ailing parent who's failing or having newborn twins. So this book, 2022, has, which I think you can get for $10 on Kindle, or used to be able to, talks about diversity programs in corporations, and it covers a lot of the research. So if you're interested in other studies that found similar things, you can probably find this as a PDF online somewhere. You might want to have a look at this. If you know, often people want further evidence when they're talking to their superiors or to their task force about we should do this. That's just one study. So you'll find a bunch of other studies in support of all these points. Many people have been studying this stuff for years, but they tend to study one practice at a time. The comparative advantage of our study is that we have a way of studying everything at once. And, you know, partly thanks to the foresight of the Nixon administration, a Republican who you wouldn't have expected, that really doubled down on let's collect data on all this stuff. Let's make sure we have good data on all this stuff. Questions?
Okay, let's do it this way, that you can ask the questions. I'm going to repeat them for the online audience so that everyone hears all the questions, but you can of course ask your questions on your own. So I didn't see who was first, sorry. So go ahead. You can also repeat them on your own. So go ahead. We just need to repeat the question.
Okay. It looks like things are bad for people who are harassed. Are there any positive models for how to deal with harassment generally? So we have a paper in Harvard Business Review, I think 2019, that looks at harassment, and this is harassment in corporations and alternative strategies for dealing with harassment. So I would just say two things. Harassment training, as it's usually offered, which is trying to convince people that they are that they are prone to harassment without realizing it. They don't know that the things they say would be perceived as harassment, and then pointing to the legal or career consequences to the grievance system. So we know from many federal studies that that backfires. That kind of training backfires. What has been effective, and I think this aligns with what I've been saying, is training that takes a bystander intervention approach. So treat everybody in the training like they are an ally of people who are being harassed, and like they want to stop it, like they're a good person. Just start with that assumption. You're not going to convince people that they're a bad person and get them to change their ways. If they are truly evil, they're just not going to change. So, and we know that from harassers. People who harass once are likely to just keep doing it. So, but bystander intervention training seems to be quite effective at getting people to, in the moment, say something if they see somebody else harassing. But then they're also going through this, oh yeah, I better not, you know, I used to say this, but now I get how that would look to somebody. And I'm a champion of this. In terms of, so grievance procedures can have very adverse effects. Many studies show this on people who file a grievance. And what we show in this piece in Harvard Business Review, there was also a piece in PNAS. So it's showing basically the same thing. So what we see about grievance procedures is that processes that are less conflictual and judicial in tone have been more effective. So having an ombudsperson who you can go to and talk to, but who doesn't start a complaint procedure and doesn't start some kind of quasi-judicial kangaroo court thing where the person comes in and has to explain themselves. Or dispute resolution systems have been hugely effective. The US Post Office has found great success with using dispute resolution, where people don't have to leave their jobs, the people who file complaints, and the majority of them are happy with the outcome. Almost no one is happy with the outcome of filing a sexual harassment complaint because they usually leave their jobs.
So maybe we can alternate questions from the online audience and the audience here. And there was one that goes in the direction of the previous one. It says the examples presented assist marginalized individuals to better negotiate the system, but don't actually aim directly to change the system. What does the research tell us about systemic and structural change?
Well, I would say that I talked about two practices that are systemic. Making sure that everybody gets a mentor, because mentoring resources are very important to academic careers, and when they're informally allocated, they're not fairly allocated. And deliberate recruitment of people who are underrepresented on the faculty. So telling departments, find people who are underrepresented and you can hire them. That's a huge incentive for departments. And what we're seeing in the data is it works, because those people are mostly hired as assistant professors, and organizations later have people in, see those people in tenured jobs. That's what we're looking at here. There are many other things, there are many other systemic changes that would be important to make. The reason we're not studying them is because there are things that no institution has. So we're constrained by what institutions currently have. So, for example, the tenure clock in career systems is insane because it coincides with childbearing and child rearing years. So it like hits you, and also often with the years in which people have aging parents. And so that can all hit you at once. Why wouldn't the career system be flexible so that you could decide when you want to come up for tenure? Or why do we even, I mean, there are lots of reasons to believe in tenure, but couldn't we have another career system where, as in Scandinavia, in most places, if you get a job as an assistant professor, you're a public sector employee and you can't really be fired. Why wouldn't we have that system? So the things that we would like to study, unfortunately, schools haven't been able to try in terms of systemic changes.
I think Heike Pantermann.
This isn't my area of
Sorry,
research.
we just need to repeat the question for the online
I
audience.
keep thinking you're doing it, but obviously you
I can also do it.
No.
Yeah, it's about the first generation students. How did you frame it? How can you, you know what, I think it's so stupid. I give you the microphone.
Thank you. So Mr. Dobbin said that, for example, female physicist students, they need a female professor in the department to kind of keep on going with their studies. And what about something you cannot see, like first generation academics?
So I was starting to say this isn't something we can study directly, just because of that's not our focus of research. There are some small scale studies showing that if those people get a mentor who they relate to, because often there won't be people who are first generation in the tenured professoriate, because that's not how academia used to work. So that is first generation college graduates. So it looks like having a strong mentoring relationship with somebody who's devoted to you, committed to you, can make a big difference for keeping those first generation students in the academic pipeline.
So let's take another question from the online audience. It says, in the case of a reported harassment incident, what strategies can institutions use to discreetly and ethically identify whether others have had similar experiences with the alleged harasser without compromising confidentiality or appearing to initiate a broad investigation prematurely?
Well, there have been, well, here's one thing they can do. They can confidentially record the identity of the person charged with or accused of harassment in a private system that's secure and that's only available to other people who receive harassment complaints, so professionals in the university. So a number of universities have tried something like this. One, as we know, harassment tends to be serial. So if somebody has harassed once, it's pretty likely they're going to harass again, or right, sexual abuse. So at least at the university level, you can get a sense of whether, for example, somebody is harassing undergraduate students and junior faculty. Now, so that taps into at least people who've had complaints, but at different levels or to different people in the organization. There are a couple of online platforms that universities can subscribe to where people can anonymously report a problem and they can be put in touch with other people who have a problem with the same perpetrator. And those people can decide to collectively bring something to the administration, bring a complaint to the administration, but it's all the participation is all voluntary. I'm forgetting the name of the big one, but if you Google it, there are a couple that universities use. So that's one way. I mean, that's basically, if you do that, you're leaving the university out until you get 3 people who are willing to formally file a complaint.
So I think it was here in the front.
First, thank you for your talk. I have a series of questions. The first one is really practical. I would like to know how strong are the changes. So for example, when you show an increase of 10% of shares for Asian women, let's say, then how many tenure position does that mean? Because I suppose that the starting group is already quite underrepresented.
Yes, I mean, I'm showing you statistically significant effects. One thing to keep in mind is I showed you effects across a lot of different practices. When organizations put all the practices in, because all of these variables are in the same model, they're all having those positive effects. So 10% of positive effect, if only 2% of faculty are Asian American women, is not a huge numerical change. But if you look across the practices, if universities do 5 things that have 10% impacts, then we're seeing 50% more Asian American women on the faculty, net of everything else, right? So this is controlling for existing trends and such. So I think it's promising to think about the effects of these models in those terms.
I had also a question about the healthcare American system. I was wondering if there were sick days given to the parents when a child is sick, because we have that in Germany. And I also wondered how that affect your statistics in terms of taking care of a child and pursuing then a university career.
There's no national law requiring sick days, even if you are sick.
Okay.
Much less your child. It's up to the university.
I have just one question that is related with that. Also for the statistics about family support, you actually only show women groups. So I suppose this has to do with the significativity of the answers in the men group, but it seems to indicate that actually fathers who pursue studies don't really participate to educating the child.
So I mentioned that I left men out in these models, but it's partly because for some of the programs, there's a version, so take tenure clock extensions or parental leaves. There's a version that's only for women, and there's a version that's for both men and women. And so in these models, we combine those, but then when they're combined, the effects on men are not significant. But when we look at them individually, for example, tenure clock extensions for both men and women have significant positive effects on the groups of women, but also on Black, Hispanic, and Asian American men. So, and that's the general pattern. The book shows this more convincingly or more thoroughly in the corporate world. So, but important question. Thank you. Thanks. It's good we clarified that. And I want to say when we talk about non-white men and women in the United States, we're talking about immigrants. So Asian American, 65% of Asian American adults in the US are immigrants themselves. So we're talking about immigrants. When we talk about Hispanic adults, 45% of Hispanic adults are immigrants. So we're talking about a lot of immigrants in these models. And when we talk about Black Americans, we're disproportionately talking about first-generation college students in academia and people who have lower incomes and less wealth, as I mentioned, 1/10 of the wealth of their white peers. So I just mentioned that because I think it's important to think about, well, how is this generalizable to Germany? What about France? Well, we're looking at a lot of immigrants here, and we're looking at groups that are representative of other kinds of disadvantage. Unfortunately, we don't have first-gen status and first-generation college student, and we don't have we don't have parental income. We'd love to have that, but we're trying to estimate parental income in a different data set to get at that.
So maybe there's one question to the question of wealth. It says Asian, Black, and Hispanic women particularly benefit from work-life help. And this was partially attributed to disparities in wealth between demographics. Is it possible to study, or have you studied how the effects of different interventions change when there is a focus on wealth?
I'm not sure what do you think that means when there is a focus on wealth? Well, we don't have programs of this sort. We don't have diversity programs that are focused on wealth, except for the fact that some of these programs, like childcare centers, some of them are subsidized for faculty who have relatively low wealth and income.
So maybe it's more in terms of the study focus. If you don't take like the ethnic background, but rather wealth as a factor to study.
Yeah, unfortunately, the great data we have don't cover faculty wealth. We do have another data set that covers faculty income that's individual level. And so we're trying to mess around with that now, but even that data set doesn't have wealth. Americans won't ask about wealth, or won't respond to questions about wealth, but they will about race.
I'm sorry, I totally missed who is next because I'm focusing on both.
Hey, thanks very much for the talk. I really liked how you showed us what can change when you go from making the faculty the problem to making the faculty the solution. It kind of gives me some optimism that there's possibility to change. However, I'm wondering, like from a non-faculty perspective, I feel that the hurdles to get the faculty to move are extremely high. So to actually initiate task forces to first pinpoint the first data sets you need to actually show there is a problem, to that the first people in motion that they actually at least start to move in a direction to eventually get together a task force to change something. So I was wondering whether you have any thoughts about how this can be initiated, like in a proper way. Also, not to blame the people by doing it, so not to end up in the same trap again. And yeah, how to, I don't know, make it more fluid and more viable to actually live it that way.
Well, I think two answers to that. One, on how do you get faculty to be interested in this? Leadership really makes a difference. So if the head of the organization or the dean of the faculty says, okay, this is going to be a priority now, and says, I would like each department chair to join a task force. Or if you can't, if you're too overtaxed, send your lieutenant, send your second in command, the associate chair or something. And it can be very effective if the dean or president becomes a member of that task force, because it just signals, okay, this is a priority. This is something we need to pay attention to. Now, once on the task force, there's still a challenge in convincing people that there's a problem if you don't have data. And certainly in some American universities, they won't share data on faculty diversity. Although the data that I have are public. You can look these data up. So most universities at least will allow the committee to look at those data. But if you don't have the data, one of the things that can be very effective is doing exit interviews with people who leave the university to try to figure out, why did you leave? And then showing those to the faculty on the committee. Or in some cases, the committee does its own studies of the junior faculty, where they'll either commission some sociology or anthropology students to do interviews, or they'll go do some themselves. What is it like to be a young Asian American man in anthropology? What is it like to be and often those are really eye-opening, because often white men faculty have never really talked to somebody outside of their own group. And because often they're in the chemistry department where there aren't any women tenured faculty. There's 2 women junior faculty. She keeps her distance from me, so I don't want to mess with her. So what would it look like if I had lunch with her too often? So what we've seen anecdotally is that that kind of work from the task force can be very effective in changing how people think. The other thing that really works is you're assigned by somebody else, a protege in a mentoring program, who doesn't look like you. You're suddenly hearing stories that make your organization sound like it's not a meritocracy. Because because people who are on the tenured faculty, white men, tend to think that the system is totally meritocratic because they deserve to be in the jobs they had. It's kind of hard. And if you say the system's not meritocratic, it's a threat to them. But if they get to know somebody who's been excluded from a grant proposal for no good reason, because somebody thought they might get pregnant. If you talk to somebody who is the only African American in the social sciences and nobody ever puts them on a committee, or only ever asks them to be on the diversity committee, not some other committee that would be important, like the promotion committee or the junior faculty Senate position, I think people start to see the lack of meritocracy, and it does change people's minds.
So regarding data, there was also a question about countries and areas that are not legally allowed to collect data on race, such as Germany. How would you suggest universities or individuals that are determined to understand their DEI efforts further or deeper go about tackling this legal hurdle? Are there reliable workarounds that you could share?
Well, I would first of all move to another country. You know, if you aren't measuring it, I honestly don't know how you can manage it. I mean, I didn't mean to dismiss your question about not being able to convince people on task forces if you don't have the data. You can't have the data. I know that. So, and ideally, I mean, the data are really convincing, especially if you see separations. I don't know what. I mean, I should ask you, how do you answer that question?
I mean, we try to collect data on a voluntary base, like with a survey we did recently. So that's a starting point. But maybe I can hand the microphone to Turo Stadler, who has a lot more experience with this.
Well, we found that that we can totally collect this data. Like, so we can't make it mandatory. Yeah. So, but for example, we can approximate. We have real problems with measuring ethnic, racial identity or religious religion, but we can approximate very well through migration histories, actually, and collect the data on a voluntary basis is already very, very helpful to see like whom do we have on a voluntary basis at each career level. So I don't actually see that problem. We despite the so of course it's voluntary, but we do not collect this data on a routine basis, and I think that's a real mistake. Like, because I couldn't agree more. If we don't, we would never say that that we do non-evidence measures flying completely blind in other areas that we need to improve on. And so I'm always very surprised why we have, but Germany has a massive lack of data. We only have data for women and then for international origin, actually, on a systematic basis. So I had a question for you, because what I think what you're doing, and I think the success factors for change. So because you said, like, do stay away from threat interventions and merely legal information, because they really don't work, and that's not very surprising. We have known that for any form of behavior change, that threat does really not work. So and for decades we've known that. So it's kind of surprising that these interventions persist. And then you say one of the main success factors is involve leadership, and I think that is not happening a lot. And Christopher, you're here, right? So, but this is often these talks or discussions how to improve the situation are not like so necessarily involving the highest leadership and department heads, I think. So, but one thing that you seem to be doing is to really widen the conceptualization of what it means to talk about diversity, to include care work and to include wealth, for example. So, and I think that this is in a way, and in my mind, so first generation academic status should be one of the cornerstones of this, because it also widens the empathy gap. So if these diversity programs are just for of minorities in people not like me, but as soon as we bring in first generation academics, it's really a lot more people like that that can feel as allies and are actually allies, because they can empathize with the difficulties. But invisible diversity domains are really hard to address because nobody talks about them. People kind of have the lived experience on their own and are not sharing their experiences. So I think it's tremendous that you're saying, like, so let's get this data on first generation academics. And I think this is very, very promising. One thing that we also found is living with chronic conditions. We found at the Charité, when we did the staff and student survey, that on average, people have 3.5 diverse domains that affect them. But most of them are invisible. So they're not, except for, of course, women are visible and skin color. But so So there is a lot of diverse domains that affect people, but we are not talking about them. So for example, living with chronic conditions or disabilities, a lot of them are invisible. And so I'm wondering if you have gone into this direction as well to widen what it means, what diversity means by including care work. Is that intentional? Did you think about that?
So for all of our work, we depend on federal data collected by mandate over many decades. And so there are some real advantages to having those data. But I couldn't agree more that including people who have chronic conditions, people with disabilities who have disabilities, people, LGBTQ status people, will expand the scope of what this means and will expand support for these programs. I would say, you know, among those groups, especially people who are first generation, people who come from financially disadvantaged backgrounds, but no other. And I think we were discussing before, I think it's a huge problem for American politics right now, because the Republicans were the party of the elite, and they're still the party of billionaires, but in some insane way, they've attracted the white working class. Without the white working class, they wouldn't be in power. And we need to kind of reboot the diversity dialogue to make clear that anybody who comes from a disadvantaged background, it's about mobility. It's about meritocracy, making sure that people from all backgrounds have a chance. And that, honestly, white working class men, I mean, they have among the highest rates of suicide, the highest rates of death by drug overdose, death by alcoholism. I mean, that's a group that needs more attention. But anyway, but I really appreciated your answer to the question about collecting data. I mean, everybody keeps telling me we'd never get data like yours in Germany, but it's hopeful that you don't need that many panels. You don't need that many years of data to see whether things are getting better or worse. And what kinds of response rates do you get for the voluntary?
We have a very high one, but it was hard work to do. So we have a little bit less than 50%, which is massive for us.
But that doesn't give you a...
But it's quite good in terms of representation. We checked this with the official statistics we have. Okay. So this worked very well for our institute, but of course we cannot compare with others. We have time for 2 more short questions. There was one
short answers, maybe.
My question was more of like a understanding question. Like in Germany, we have, for like the universities and research institutes, we have a specific wage for each position going up in like the hierarchy. So professors would be in a W3, things like that. And so there's a bit of a, not as much like having to figure out how much wage you're going to get when you go into like a position like that. Is there a similar process in America? Like, are the wages comparable when you receive your tenure, or is it you have to like fight for your wage?
I mean, usually if you want a raise, you have to get a job offer from another institution. So some states have, like California has a very rigid set of categories that but even if you get an offer from another institution, they just put you in a different category. So it's, but was there an idea behind that question?
Well, it makes like the wealth question, for example, in Germany, once you've reached a certain academic position, you are guaranteed at least a minimum of wealth comparable to other people in that position. Of course, like work experience plays into all that. But like if you don't have that, it also means that like all the questions of having to fight for your wage also play into the academia in America, which we don't have that much.
Like huge issue. And among tenured professors, some people in the same discipline make 4 times as much as other people in the same discipline, sometimes in the same department.
I'm wondering going forward, since the DEI programs have largely been canceled in the United States, it would mean that you wouldn't be able to identify measures going forward that are called by the names they have been called so far. I'm wondering, in view of the fact that many programs have been canceled, are there efforts behind the scenes to continue to do the work, but perhaps using different terminology? And will that play into measuring in the future?
Are we still being recorded? A lot of corporations, I'll just talk about corporations. A lot of corporations have just renamed some of their programs. So for example, their minority internship program is now just an internship program. Their diversity training is now civility training. So a lot of corporations have tried to rename things, and what's striking is a lot of them haven't fired many people. But I will say in universities, Florida and Texas were the first states to get governors who fired all of the diversity staff, and those people are just gone. So.
Well, that makes it difficult to end on a positive note.
Sorry about
but it's really important to point out that we're really happy to have you here, and we look forward to now another hour of exchange with the Board of Directors, BIH. We will report also to Charité faculty and Board of Directors what we can learn from you. I think it's highly relevant, your studies here to us and to many other disciplines in the public and also the private sector in Germany. So many thanks for the insight that you provided. It's been extremely helpful, at least to me, but I'm sure that also to many others here and also online, and we'll spread the word. So, okay, thank you.
Thank you for very interesting questions.